We've just watched a film on the high street. It's clearly a really hard time for so many businesses. And the IPPR estimates that more than 500,000 could go under this spring without more government support. What's your analysis?
That's absolutely right. And I think the wider point is that we are still in the crisis. Obviously, there's a roadmap out of it, but you keep asking the question, should we be moving to solve the public finances now, or should we be dealing with the crisis? And I'm absolutely clear on this. We have got to sustain the support for businesses until we get to the other side of this. And perhaps the thing to reflect on is all of the things that the Chancellor has already done will almost be in vain if lots of businesses fail in the next 3 months. So I'm categorically in that camp. And of course, that does mean for high street businesses, yes, welcome the money that's been talked about today, but we've got to think about some of the underlying points as well. And of course, that includes business rates reform.
Just to unpick some of what you said there, you're talking there about the support needed to continue, otherwise businesses will fail. What kind of timeframe are you talking about? I thought it was pretty clear from Rishi Sunak that, they want to extend the support to the end of the roadmap, which is in June. But do you think that actually some of the support needs to actually go a bit further?
Well, it's interesting because business is not sort of uniform, is it here? So quite rightly, there's a lot of talk about the businesses that have been most seriously affected. That's what your film just talked about. And I hope that for them, it really is a question of getting to the reopening, perhaps a little beyond that, because anyone who's run a business knows that the period in which you're gearing back up is also very vulnerable in cash flow. But I'm optimistic that by the summer, we will see that consumer-led recovery. But there are other businesses where other sectors where the damage is much, much more long term. Let's go to the other extreme, perhaps an aerospace business. Lots of those in the West Midlands. They are not suddenly going to bounce back. They've still got lots of people on furlough. Their levels of demand are very low. And the way they're going to need to come back is by investing in new kit for the upturn. And that's all about the sort of tax advantages for them. And that is a much, much longer burn that some of those really competitive sectors will be able to come back strongly.
It's interesting because you're touching there on sort of long-term tax reform, business rates, for example, to help the high street, things directed at certain industries to help their working climate be a bit more attractive. What kind of things do you want to see?
Well, I think the first thing around tax that we're already seeing, actually, is the tax on jobs or the encouragement of businesses to take more people on. The primary challenge, I'll be honest about the situation in the West Midlands, 85,000 more people claiming universal credit benefits than this time last year. That is an enormous change. So the headroom that the Chancellor may still have left have already, I think, been applied quite wisely to some of the business advantages, taking on apprentices, so that £3,000 allowance there, the Kickstart scheme, obviously, and then, of course, what's also being done, hopefully, around there's a talk in the papers today about national insurance holidays for recruiting. So that would all try to make it more attractive for businesses to recruit people. But then we're also going to need to think about what helps companies invest in the long term. And the best approach there is definitely tax allowance against investment.
What about corporation tax? A lot of discussion around potential rises to corporation tax. Do you think that would be a good idea to try and get the public finances in order?
Well, let's take the question a little bit more broadly, then we'll come back to corporation tax head on. Obviously, we have got to, over time, address the public finances. Anyone who denies that, I'm afraid, is denying the reality. But as your first question drew out, it's a question of when. And it's also true to say that we say we've all been in this together, but actually some sectors have had better times and some individuals have had better times. So it is going to be necessary to see some tax rises in the areas that have probably done better. So, the talk about online taxes. I do again say categorically that is the right thing to do. They have had a good time. It is right they bear a little bit more of the burden. On corporation tax, I would regret it personally because I do think Britain's very competitive corporation tax has been right, but I would fully accept there are some really tough choices for the Chancellor. And if the end judgment is that's got to go up a few points, as he's talked about in the papers today, we'd still be relatively competitive. And I would accept that possibly as a price to pay.
You mentioned online tax. It's a fiendishly difficult place to tax because of the international, global state of affairs. What kind of things could the Chancellor look at? I mean, there's, for example, in the Sunday Telegraph today, reports of new tax on online deliveries. Is that the kind of thing that you think would work?
You could do. I mean, you can have an online sales tax. It could be really very blunt like that. And of course, the delivery tax has been talked about, but also actually reform of business rates would, if you just change the balance of contribution between high street premises and, say, distribution warehouses, you can tilt to different sectors of the economy. So there are ways of doing it.
You're, of course, talking to us from Birmingham, and Mayor of the West Midlands. How concerned are you about the pandemic's impact on the levelling up agenda?
It's a really interesting question, actually, because what we have seen is that pre-pandemic, the economy was performing really well. We had the fastest growth of any region outside London over the previous 10 years, actually record employment numbers, great investment. But very sadly, it looks as though we may be the worst affected region. So from best to worst is pretty dramatic. So there is an effect. But what will ultimately drive levelling up is all of the work around retraining, opportunities, skills, and we can continue to do that. And actually, in the region, we've continued to try to make great progress on that. So if I was asking for one thing around levelling up, it wouldn't necessarily be about roads and bridges and all of that. It would actually, let's really concentrate on the retraining of the people who've lost their job and get them ready for the industries of the future. And in our case, the whole electric vehicle industry is critical, and of course, the digital sector. And just one stat that I think your viewers found interesting, Sophie, all the retraining we're doing in digital, anyone who goes through our schemes, almost anyone is employed after them. There are still parts of the economy that are growing, and that's where the retraining needs to be focused.
Are you worried that the government's taken its eye off the levelling up agenda that it talked about so much during the election?
No, I'm not actually. It would be, almost superhuman not to have had to move complete focus to tackling the pandemic, of course. And so perhaps some of the things that we would otherwise have seen haven't come through. I would accept that. But actually, is there an utter commitment to it? We've heard about the Levelling Up Fund, for example. The commitment to infrastructure spend in the regions is absolutely there. I hope we're going to hear about the Towns Fund. That's a good practical frontline piece around levelling up. And as I say, a lot of money's been committed on this retraining, and that will, in the long term, be the best way of raising opportunity in places like this.
I asked Rishi Sunak about the roadmap out of lockdown as well. He made it very clear that the dates given are the earliest dates at which things can be eased. But at the same time, if it's data-driven, should they also be prepared to speed things up if the data is better than expected? We know, of course, they're willing to slow things down if things aren't going in the way that they want.
So let me try to explain why I think what's been said is logical. I haven't sort of had this described to me by those in central government, but my own working out of it is at each stage we have got to assess the progress. We know that, frankly, when we unlocked after the second lockdown, the virus bounced back up. What is the time delays in the roadmap are to see that we have not got an increase from each stage of it. And then if you look at the 3 weeks, then the 5 weeks, to me, that is logical. Because if you act on the next thing before you know, with the lead time around the spread of the virus, what's happened with the previous stage, you may be making the wrong judgment. Personally, I ask for a cautious approach to this. In the West Midlands, we still have a pretty stubborn level of infections, about 169 per 100,000. So for us, and the overwhelming reaction from business here this week has been, yes, understand why that cautious but steady approach is there, because it allows us to assess progress as I've described, so we will never have to go back.
At the same time, though, lockdown, of course, has consequences too. We just heard from Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who said, every week of additional lockdown is costing not just the economy, but it's also costing so many people so much in terms of their mental health, their education, their work and everything else. It should be moved as quickly as possible, consistent with doing it safely. If we can do it quicker, we absolutely should. You disagree, then?
No, if we absolutely can, and all the evidence is pointing at that, of course, I'm sure no one would wish to say no to that. What I tried to do was explain why I think it is utterly logical that the time delays in the plan are as they are. I would dearly like it to go faster. Goodness, I lead the region that's had a terrible effect in every sense. But I do think that it is far more important that we do this once and for all and get it right and never risk the bounce back that we saw actually twice in the second half of last year.